Well, it's a real honor to be here tonight, and certainly an honor to be the Jon Jerde Chair here. I couldn't think of a more wonderful honor, and I'm just having an absolutely wonderful time with the students. It's a kind of inspiring time. So it's a real honor and a celebration of his life for me to be here tonight. So thank you. I have quite a few projects here, so I'm going to kind of speak lively and kind of speak about the work. But just before I start speaking about the work, I want to talk about a couple of pictures here. This is one of the first pictures that my clients just outside of Washington, D.C., sent me, the founders of the Glenstone Foundation, and they spoke about this craze in the art world now. The art world tends to kind of amplify the experience, where it really doesn't become a personal experience anymore. It becomes an experience of just trying to see over the next person. And they wanted to try to create a completely different experience. And so this was 3 years ago when we started this project. This was the image that we began to talk about. And this is Ed Reinhardt. And, you know, when you know Ed Reinhardt's work, it's a work that seemingly are just black pictures. But these black pictures, then, once you begin to get into the work and you slow yourself down and you see the work, you can begin to see these beautiful red geometries and dark blue geometries that begin to come through. And we began to talk to them about a way to make an architecture that was about experience, that was about slowing down and getting lost in the work that seems so lost today. So this was an extremely important thing. And this work, this is Fischli and Weiss's work, the panda and the rat here taking a little break. They hang from the ceiling there. But the founders of the Glenstone Foundation have a remarkable collection of contemporary art and are building a public museum that will be for their collection. So when we started this project about 3 years ago, we started, one of my associates went down and photographed their site, a beautiful kind of rural site just outside of Washington, D.C. He immediately came back and did this to it, which we all thought was interesting as the way to begin the project, about framing the landscape and kind of intensifying the experience with the land, about how to understand the land and to move in it and with it and to honor the land, which meant, we thought, honoring nature and honoring the light so that it began to coexist there in this beautiful setting. We also looked for a long time at kind of ways to frame the land. This is Robert Irwin's work in Italy for the Panza collection, and how he was given a space and said you could do anything you wanted. He, of course, just blew a hole in the wall. It's kind of rectangular holes that framed the landscape, that intensified that experience. So as the seasons change, as the light changes, that experience changes there. It was a really important work that Bob did there. And so we began, before we even started, we began to look at these kind of vignette pictures of ways to understand about how to frame the landscape and to begin to intensifying this experience. And here we were framing the land in a horizontal kind of way. And here's the site plan that we ended up with here. And at the very top of the image here, this is a little bit hard to read here, but let's see. Here we go again with my sense of technology. There you go. So you come in at the very top of the site here, and you come to these gravel parking lots that are a little bosque of trees. We're working with Peter Walker there in Oakland, in Berkeley. And you arrive there to a stacked timber building that's the arrivals building. With the bookstore, it's a place to get oriented. And from there, you simply take a walk in the field. You take a walk in the field around this beautiful mound there of honey locust trees, and you then discover this flat plaque of grass that's there right in front. And you arrive to this ensemble of buildings that's sitting there in the landscape. And when you turn the corner around the bosque of trees, you see this is the view, these individual volumes that are carefully placed there in this existing knoll. We're tearing the knoll up at the moment to build it, but we're putting the landscape back exactly the way that it was. Each one of those represents a permanent installation, most of them do, a permanent installation for one artist, so that they have their own proportion, their own quality of light. And we worked on most of them with the artist himself and herself there to curate and to situate these volumes there in the landscape. This one that's right here with the large window is a very quiet place where you can sit and have a pause and look back at the trees that you passed. We also wanted to make a space in the middle, a kind of quiet space, and we looked at Rangi, this beautiful rock garden that's there in Japan, and it taught us a few lessons. It taught us about kind of quiet contemplation, but also framing the landscape above and framing the sky, not the immediate sense of the landscape there as you could look straight ahead, as that kind of place of quiet and contemplation. And so here's the plan when you finally arrive at the different pavilions. You arrive here at a little opening there. You go down into the land, and you are around this planted pool, and that's the way these buildings are all tied together. We have a stacked timber cafe that's right here. And so then down below, the foundation offices there look out onto a private garden, so you don't really know they're there, but the curators are very close. And then from there, you take a walk around this garden and you go into each one of the installation rooms. This is the changing installation room that will change about every year. And then we go to Ankara, Robert Gober, Michael Heiser, Jason Rhodes, the little viewing gallery, Charles Ray, and on around to Bryce Marden and Cy Twombly. And you move around this and you come in to an installation, and then you come back out into the passage and have a quiet moment next to the pool. We learned a lot from the Louisiana there in Copenhagen about where you have an experience and then you have an experience with the landscape, so that it's a quiet experience between these kind of extraordinary works of our time, of this moment, and they will be there most of them will be there in perpetuity. We were beginning then to slowly understand what to make the building out of, and we looked very closely at Michael Heiser. No, I'm sorry, man, I'm losing it here. Somebody tell me who this is. Carl Andre, man, getting older every day. Carl Andre. And what he did is he stacked this wood. He took something that was extraordinary out of the ordinary. He cut it, and we wanted to make a facade that took that same idea of taking a kind of an ordinary material and by stacking it very carefully, making it extraordinary. So we took this concrete block made out of absolutely gray concrete that was only tempered by the temperature and humidity that was made. We have 22,000 blocks on the site, and we're making them over a year and a half. So every time they make one, it has a slightly different temperature and humidity there in the plant. This is our rendering, and it's turning out as the blocks are being made, they're up to 2,000 or 3,000 now, that this is the kind of character that they'll get just by honoring the specificity of the material that it's made of. And so this is it inside. It's all load-bearing. It stacks one on top of the next with a little bit of a shim in there, maybe a 1/4-inch shim as it goes up. So the palette inside is very simple. It's a concrete slab, concrete ceiling, and these concrete blocks that are both inside and out. And we wanted to keep the forms extremely simple to honor the materiality and to honor the light as the light began to move around these forms. Here are the way the elevations are composed around, and they were really composed from the inside out as these separate buildings began to take shape with the artist and with the works and with the quality of light in mind. They began to make their way curatorially around this pool. Here is Michael Heiser's one that happens to be outdoors. This is the one from the end. So they kind of make a little ensemble of buildings there, kind of very much about this promenade, this kind of knoll that projects out into the landscape. When we started the project, this was the way we started. We started by making these buildings kind of submerged in the landscape, where you walked embedded into the land. And we started by taking very simple geometries. This one happened to be a cube. And we simply cut a hole in the ceiling so that the light would have plenty of time to fall. But we kept the opening in the ceiling, this aperture to the sky, very simple there. And we looked, this was oddly enough, this is an upside down inspirational view. This is Michael Heiser's work that he has at DIA. And we thought about kind of flipping this on its ear there, flipping this upside down and allowing the light to come through this almost kind of, to me, this reminded me of a Roman aperture, kind of simple aperture to the sky. And so then as we started to progress, we started opening the building up to the landscape. As you moved from building to building there, you started to open it up to the sky. So these are much more recent, actually, the way the building is under construction now. This is Ankarar's Pavilion as it sits there. And there are his paintings. There's the aperture there. We wanted to take and to pull the light down from the very top and give it a lot of time to kind of very softly come down to the works. And we have quite a lot of light at the bottom here. It is about 120 foot candles there at the bottom. We're able to open and close this. We did an enormous number of studies with Ove Arup to control the quantity of light so that the number of hours there wouldn't damage the works. And so as you move around, here's the cubic room that we started with, but with a very long aperture there of concrete to let the light very softly fall against the concrete so that the light inside the room would be a very soft light. You don't have to turn a light bulb here all day long, so that although you don't get any direct sunshine there, because that would begin to hurt the art, the glass up here at the top is made of translucent glass so that the light in there moves very softly during the day. The building is right on the cardinal points, so it's almost like a compass, and the light softly shifts from wall to wall to wall with some very soft intensity there. This is the room with Bryce Martin's painting in it, with another kind of aperture that sits in its relationship to the pool out that we, as that pause and contemplation room. The outdoor Michael Heiser room here, where you go outdoors, and we worked with him on the proportion of the room and the particular situation that his work sits in. And here's this stacked timber inside room there that is a kind of pause and contemplation moment there with an enormous piece of glass that opens up to the landscape. It's one of the few pavilions where there is a kind of real moment of pause that looks out as opposed to looking inward. When we first started, we wanted to try to understand the light. This is when we didn't quite understand the materiality yet, but as you moved around this passage, we wanted to follow the daylight, and so the daylight kind of takes you around this passage with just the daylight. We had many, many of these things as you begin to move around this kind of unfolding experience, going from pavilion to pavilion, and you're backing up now to the pool. Always the camera was turned towards this wall that is to the landscape behind. And each one of the pavilions then had these kind of deep halls that would go from the passage into each one of the works in a kind of subtle way to prepare you to see the work that was inside, so that the light would have a chance to change from moment to moment there as you moved through. Each one of these different situations is different, and I think they've changed a lot over time, but these were those original studies that dealt simply with light and form as a way of defining the passage. Here's a rendering. This field will be planted with grasses that will grow like this, and the field will be put back exactly the way that is right now. You can see the kind of ensemble of buildings as they make their way around the promenade. This is how you slip into the main front door, the entrance, the stacked blocks, and this glass entrance. They want only maybe 50 people to be inside the museum at one time to try to get this experience back, this kind of getting lost in the work, to have a real experience with these works. Down at the bottom of the stair opening onto the pool. And from a material standpoint, the building is really made of concrete, the blocks, and these enormous pieces of glass that are flush with these kind of raw stainless steel mullions, so that there's an enormous precision with the glass and with the mullions, with the way it's placed against the kind of directness of the concrete. This is Michael Heiser's room, kind of an extraordinary work there, situated with his proportions outdoors in this room, seeing the sky and some of the immediate landscape, and some of the other, as you're on the top. This is probably not a view most people will get, but it's over the pool, in case you kind of wander up to looking over it. So this next project is a project that we're just about to finish. It's the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York. And this museum was completely different. And we started off with a situation here that I had certainly never encountered. It's the display of glass works. And we didn't quite understand glass or what it meant until we took a work of glass. And to tell you the truth, we took a beautiful alto vase out onto the street there in New York right after we got the project, and we held it up to the light, and it came alive and it seemed to embody the light. It seemed to hold the light. And there was a lot of light out there in the daylight. And so we began to research it a lot, and we researched it but in the meantime, here's the situation. There are these existing buildings that were originally done. There are some additions. This is Gunnar Burkett's. And there's an addition here by Henry Smith Miller and Laurie Hawkinson. This is our new building with this new kind of town green that we're making. So the buildings really had to kind of fit together and knit together around those works. And so when we had this curiosity about glass, we began to employ, as we usually do with Daylight Over Arup, with Andy Sedgwick in London and Matt Franks there in New York, we began to examine how much light could this work take. And we discovered that contemporary glass is not damaged by light. It's damaged by temperature and humidity, so that has to be controlled. But the amount of daylight, we could get as much as we needed there. We can get enough to make this work just glow there with the light. So we did all these computer experiments along with physical experiments with the curators, and we began to search for a way, since these works sat on the floor, to begin to employ a system that would allow for the light to get pushed to the floor from the skylights. So we entirely skylit the building and allowed this light. Most of the time you try to direct the light to the walls, but here we want to direct the light directly to the floor, to push it to the floor so that these works would be amplified. And so we developed a system so that the light would have a chance to come from the skylight down through these beams and live up there in the zone where we could exhaust the heat, we could keep the sprinklers and the artificial light when it was dark. The smoke detectors are all up there. But in working with Guy Nordenson, we worked on a system of concrete walls, these soft walls that held the air and provided all of the structural stability for the building. Like the core in an office building, as the forces and the loads get transferred from the skin of the building through the beams, from the roof through the beams, they all attach to these walls, and those walls kept the stability of the building, much like a core, that kind of shear and torque that happens in a normal building. So the beams and the walls not only held the air and the structural stability, but also dealt with the kind of moving, changing poetry of the light as it moved down to the works. We found one Canadian firm in precast here that would build these. These are 3.5 inches thick by a little over 4 feet tall, and in some cases span 60 feet. And these were made in the wilderness up in Canada, and they built it within an inch of their lives. And they're absolutely gray concrete with no admixtures. You can really see kind of the nature of the material here. We also learned very quickly that the glass didn't want to have side light because side light puts glass in silhouette. So we have these windows here that have an aperture there to the landscape, to our new green, and then these rooms that are away from this porch that have the top light. And so I'll just scroll through these very quickly. These were some that were taken just a few weeks ago. The building has, even in the last 2 weeks, they're installing the works. When you walked into these rooms, we wanted these rooms to be like clouds, seemingly rooms without corners, so that the works on the floor would simply levitate and be there in this kind of whiteness there, but in kind of very soft cloud-like rooms. You can see the way the beams sit over the walls and the light is beginning to come in. Each one of the rooms is of different size and different scale, as worked on with the curators. They're heavy walls, they're thick, they hold the air and deal with all of the stability issues here. You can see the quality of light in the beams as they go overhead, and the finishing of the floor that has now been completed. And we wanted these works to live in this kind of abstract environment so that when you walked into these rooms and this container is there, that it's all about the works, that the works sit there and simply are honored by the kind of softness of this room and just levitate off the floor there. and let the light really do the work, between the light and the works. We have this long window there that's 150 feet long that looks out onto the town green. Each one of the rooms is unique to the collections that it holds. And so the skin, this is the skin under construction, was conceived as a vitrine in the way that one looks at a vitrine in a museum. It's made of glass. It's made of a kind of 1.25 inch piece of laminated glass, and we developed an absolutely white inner layer that goes in between so that this glass would be absolutely white, and then it became slightly frosted as it got towards the windows there, so that this is kind of like a vitrine. And the way a vitrine sits there very simply, very minimally, framing and honoring the work inside. It sits there, it has a beautiful reflectivity. It's completely clear glass that's been laminated and is beginning to pick up the light there in Corning. We're going to open towards the end of May, so they're installing all of the works now. Trees and things are to come in the spring to kind of enforce the landscape. We also are restoring this Wallace Harrison building from the early 50s. It's called a ventilator building. Contemporary glass will be made there. And I think these are the two slides that Miriam, my assistant, stuck in there. Thought I was going to talk about these in the beginning, but here they are. These are two images that really have become important to our office over the last 15 years that we've been in practice. This is Dan Graham, who has meant a lot to me. I had the great fortune of making his working drawings right after I started our practice. And I learned about kind of grounding the work in not in a way of using indigenous materials, but in a way of using transparency and reflection and the light to begin to place this work in this place with this light, with this moving and changing reflection and light. It's an extremely important moment for us as we continue to search. Here we are back at Corning again. So, thought there was going to be another Michael Heiser image there in the desert, but maybe that's going to be a surprise a little later. So here we are in Madison, Wisconsin, and this is one of the reasons why I have loved being an architect. These are two professors who are 28, 29 years old, who teach there and wanted a contemporary house, and they bought, this is really unusual, they bought the backyards of these two houses right here in this historic neighborhood. It's got a Louis Sullivan house across the way, and it's got these old houses there, and they bought this garden there that had been there for a pretty long time in the backyards, and they wanted a tiny house that was under 2,000 square feet. Quite an unusual project, and these really spirited professors. I know when I was 28, 29, I wasn't thinking about building a house or even having any kind of ambitious moments there. So I think they have a lot of courage and spirit here to try to do this. But right about the time that I was starting this, I paid a visit to UVA. And who can't go there and not love Thomas Jefferson's walls? I mean, these things are just extraordinary. The single width of brick in these gardens has really been a huge moment. And so it began to occur to me to take and to try to reclaim this garden with a very soft continuous wall made out of reclaimed brick. And so we've taken this brick from a warehouse just outside of Chicago, and we've made this serpentine shape that goes all the way around the site and defines each one of the rooms. And then this pane of glass has a slight bit of reflectivity to it. It projects out 1 inch, which defines the thickness of the glass itself. And so as this moves around and around the site, it defines the different places there in the house and gives a kind of a presence there that seems to accept this place in this kind of found garden with all of these different conditions. The interiors are simply whitewashed with cedar floors, very simple, with framed views of the landscape there. This is a great moment when the foundation was being poured. This contractor, we found a swimming pool subcontractor here to make these forms out of this kind of slip form system, and he made it out of this plywood. It looks like a work of art, and these things were on the money. It was absolutely remarkable as a way to define this place. And so here's another kind of curious project, just quickly, where we were searching here. These are 2 fields that are in upstate New York, and for the longest time, we couldn't figure out how to build in these fields. These fields seem so ominous and scaleless and beautiful. And we'd searched for a long time about how to kind of build here. And we finally began to think about a place that you could drive to and park and then walk and discover this place. Here is my Michael Heiser image. Miriam's great. And I mean, here I love Michael Heiser. Can you imagine going out in the desert with your backhoe and digging and occupying the land, cutting the land, this kind of intervention there? I mean, it is quite a moment that he made. This is a really important image to our office, a kind of willful moment there out in the desert and out in the land. So we began to look as a way of dealing with the landscape, about submerging it in the land. And so we looked for a long time at the farming community around the neighborhood and how they carve out these places in the landscape. They happen to use these precast elements there to kind of carve themselves into the land, and they store grain here. Some of them don't even bother to put the concrete in there. They just store it back in the landscape. And we looked at the kind of blackness there, this kind of blackness of going into the earth. Again, Michael Heiser's work, Mary Mist there on the right, about taking and kind of violating the datum of the earth with this intervention. And so we thought about this house, about putting it in the landscape, this kind of dark house there, as it sat as this U-shaped garden that was carved out that faces there in the landscape. So as you walk around, you discover it, and you move into it and out of it, and out of it comes the garden as kind of a threshold and a vestibule there in the landscape, as a way to intervene in this site of such simple beauty. And so we devised these shutters that would close the house completely up. And here you can see, we've been talking this morning and this afternoon in the studio about this book, In Praise of Shadows. This kind of sense that there's a kind of a shadow and a lightness there that is just a kind of magical moment. Certainly with the Japanese culture, there's that kind of sense of the shadow and the garden and the light. And we began to look at this is one of Richard Serra's amazing works. where he took this black paper and just stapled it to the wall and found this impossibly endless corner there, this corner of nothingness, absolutely void there. And we began to think about these corners as being kind of submerged in the landscape, kind of a concrete base there that comes out so everybody lands on it. And then these portals, these kind of windows that open up as shutters that open the building up to the landscape. And then some of them are quite large, 20 feet wide by 12, 13 feet tall, that begin to open itself up. This is the dining room that opens itself up to this garden, and then hence the larger landscape abroad. I think this house was a big kind of investigation for us that I don't think it's going to get built, but it really kind of pushed our understanding of what it meant to build in the land forward. This is Mary Miss's wonderful project. I think this may be from the 70s, about how she occupied the land with this void, this blackness down there. And so now to a project that we just finished, that I worked on for about 15 years. We started the practice with this when we won this competition for a United States Courthouse in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it sits down here. This is the Frank Moss Courthouse right here. This is City Hall. And we finally, after years and years, cleared the site of the other buildings that are there so we could occupy the remaining site behind this courthouse. There's the Capitol building up at the top right there. And so as the years went by, I mean, we were actually, we were kind of blessed with the idea that this project went on for a long time because we had a chance to consider what we were doing. Most of the time, architecture moves very quickly. And here we had a chance to understand, and this was an image that we pinned up for most of those years. This is an image of one of Donald Judd's boxes, and for us, it was about the materiality of this and the way that this anodized aluminum simply embodied light. It simply held the light. And it was beautiful the way that it was kind of articulate about how it was attached. These little flesh screws, the way you saw how thick the metal was. The more you looked at it year after year, the more lessons you could learn about how his work just embodies the light in the simple form made the tectonics and the light and the material. It just honors the material. And we also just recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, began to look at Ronnie Horn's work here, these wonderful glass cast cubes. She's made a lot of these. And in the way that the more light you put into this, the more it just seems to hold the light in this cubic form. It just seems to absolutely come alive. This goes back to the Corning Museum and that building trying to embody the light and serving the art with this daylight as it begins to come alive. One cast, you can begin to see the way the block is made inside with all the fissures there of the way the block was cast. So here was one of the first models that we made of the courthouse, this kind of cube that's there, that sat in the city as an iconic presence, trying to take the simplicity of the language of this old Frank Moss Courthouse building and take the whiteness of that building and the simplicity of that building and make a building that embodied that kind of iconic quality with its simple form and with its embodiment of the light in a similar way to the way that this white granite there on that building, on that existing building, seemed to embody the light. We also, at about the same time, wanted to kind of infuse the building with daylight so that you wouldn't have to turn on a light bulb inside, so that the building and the courtrooms and everything was filled with light, but we didn't want the heat. And so we developed this little micro louver here that was made out of extruded aluminum. And we pushed the light in through reflection here, so that we could get the light without the heat. And you can see on the north side, the views, the light can't come in directly straight, so it comes in indirectly. And on the east and west, it bounces around. And on the south, it's really indirect, so that it doesn't build up the heat there on the southern facade. Each one of these extrusions is simply extruded aluminum that was then milled. And here they are. There's the kind of scale of them and what each one of them does. And they're different for every facade. And so here's the setup there on the site, the Frank E. Moss Courthouse. I'm accustomed to these size blocks. They were about 800 feet long and about 200 feet wide, really, excuse me, and about, so they're really big. The streets are really wide there because of the carriages that were there during the founding of the city. And because of the security concerns and the times that we live, the building had to be set back from the street. So the building lands in a garden, like City Hall, like the Capitol building. It lands in a green place for the city. So it's set back. We have a big through-block connection that we work very closely with the city for. We have a wonderful kind of grass moment there where people can congregate. And we have a kind of celebratory entrance that goes down below, where the judges and everyone goes down below to the Sally Port as well. The courtrooms, this is where the court floor, this is actually where the square started. Really not with a Q, but with the internal planning here. The 2 courtrooms, the 4 courtrooms on each corner get complete daylight. The circulation for the courts goes right through the building. Jamie Carpenter did an extraordinary work, which I'll show you, which is right there in the middle, that it infuses the center of the building all the way up and down with a top light. And then everything in the kind of dark blue there are all of the private spaces, the jury rooms, the prisoner holding cells, the judges' elevators. All of those things are kind of consolidated in the middle there. Excuse me. So in a sense, those are the private zones that are expressed on the facade that you'll see in a second. There's the section through the building. It has a pretty large underground that connects the old and the new buildings, with parking and the Sally Port, and an enormous terrace on the top that looks out onto the city and to the extraordinary landscape that's there in Salt Lake. Here's Jamie Carpenter's amazing piece that are a series of these faceted rods that take the light from the top, but they also take the light from the sides and illuminate the entire center of the building. When I walked in when the building was finished and 180 feet in the air, and I saw an enormous pool of light on the floor down there, I couldn't believe it. I mean, Jamie did an extraordinary job of kind of drawing the light all the way down in the middle of the courthouse with these little rods. And you can see that some of them are made of polished aluminum as well as anodized aluminum. So in some cases you get a little shimmer or reflection. They're all suspended on these cables as you go up. So we began to craft the facades, and not only do the facades deal with the solar orientation, but they are a clue to what's going on inside. So this center portion right there that's a little pixelated at the moment, those are the widest louvers, and those are the louvers in the private zones. The louvers begin to open up around the courtrooms that get daylight, and then they really open up more where we've got private offices and people that work in the building. So the building is calibrated to kind of tell the narrative of what is happening behind it. And there's a monumental entrance here, which I'll show you in a second. And here are some of the images, slightly out of focus there, but that's okay. This is taken from the Moss Building. There's a kind of a white building. Here's the front entrance with the steps, the mountains there in the background, and this kind of luminous object. And I think these louvers, if they really do kind of embody, they kind of hold the light within them. And then each one of the entrances, in order to kind of expand the experience, are made out of a reflective stainless steel, so that every one of these special apertures for special occurrences in the building, from the inside and from the outside, but particularly from the inside, begin to explode and expand and frame the views of the landscape and the city. So as you're walking in, this entrance is a 3-story high front door that opens into the rest of the courtroom. And here is a space that's just off the cafe. It's a little water garden that sits back there that's just outside of the little green that we made for the city. So you can come in here and have a very quiet moment that relates to one of the public functions in the courthouse, with a reflective ceiling and the water is there on the ground. The palette inside is a combination of wood rooms and white elements. Sorry, these are a little bit overexposed there on the screen. There's the courtroom and some of the details of the facade. The water here was conceived as kind of a really flat, reflective plane, as a very minimal expression there of the landscape as it opens up to the plaza. Here are some of the louvers and how they were attached. We spent a lot of time with the GSA with window washing and maintenance and repair and all of that. So as they sit out there, they come in all different widths and different sizes and different configurations as they begin to express the nature of what goes on inside. And here's a little detail of that front portal with the little thin element of stainless steel that's there. And here's one of the portals from the jury assembly room and the water court. So from the inside, that room simply, with its reflectivity, begins to expand that horizon there. The garden that wraps all the way around with the honey locust trees. And here's a view of the different types and the sizes of louvers. They change as they move around in terms of sizes and the privacy and what happens just behind them. The glass has a continuous softening to it as a way to unify the building as it sits there in Salt Lake. That's from Main Street. Okay, and finally, I'd like to end with a little tiny project that we did a few years ago. This is a little project for a house in Salt Point, New York, about an hour and a half north of the city. It sits on a little lagoon, which is a bit slightly beyond the house here. And it's also a tiny little house. It's about 2,000, a little under 2,000 square feet. And it sits on this lawn. And about the same time when we came up to the site, we went over to Frederick Church's house, and we just amongst ourselves, we began to talk about the majesty of his works and how he's taken that Hudson Valley landscape and made it just remarkably monumental. And we wanted to take this little house and give it a sense of simplicity and kind of monumentality there as it sat on this lawn. So we made these stainless steel screens that cover the house that face to the east and to the west. The views on the ground floor are horizontally framed. And this screen, we had to build this house for hardly any money. And we found this German stainless steel manufacturer that would manufacture corrugated, perforated stainless steel. And they made and shipped all the stainless to the site for $10,000. Really kind of a remarkable thing. And that is attached to this little extruded piece of aluminum there, and that's attached back to the normal house. But we calibrated the corrugations there and the perforations so that as this screen begins to slip by, it begins to kind of dissolve itself there into the landscape, and it becomes one. It was one of the first times when we began to look at the green grass down here in the trees and the way that began to come up into the house and take on the colors of the sky and take on the colors of the landscape around it. And so here's the interior of the house. We made it all out of what I would call just maple plywood as a kind of a unifying piece. And each one of these screens sits proud about 3 or 4 inches so that the radiant heat that's hitting these screens, the screens heat up, and this air cavity back there allows for the air to go and rise up and not get as much to the weather wall, which is just behind this, which is basically just black sliding. These are Pella windows that we ordered there that looks out onto the north and south. This happens to be the northern facade and the front door. And in such a little house, we wanted to make these 3 tall spaces to give the house a sense of monumentality. And so here's the one going up to the 2nd floor with a little bench. I was just there not so long ago, and their dog still won't walk over this glass floor. It's actually quite funny. He kind of stops right there. This is quite some years he's been living there. One of these days, I guess. So anyway, these windows pop open right here, and the whole house naturally ventilates. We actually bought those. It's great. We bought those skylights at Home Depot and just made this little GRG collar that goes around it. And it lets then light all the way down kind of in the middle of the house. And then the screen porch is there as a kind of veil, and the screen porch shields the southern sun as the sun is high, doesn't let the sun come in. It's like a big shaded overhang in that place. And so here's the way the building, this little house sits on the lawn. Quite an experience to build this little thing in that part of the world there. And so that's it. Thank you so much. Would you like for me to take any?
Yeah. 2 questions. So your first project, you kind of had that the concrete block wall. You had that texture with the white, the gray. I was just wondering if that was intentional in terms of like when you're selecting different colors of the brick and stack and planning out how they would stack. And then I guess a more general question about intentionality. How do you balance that with the desire to want a project to emerge from context, like intentionality versus emergence?
That's a good question. The blocks, and I think that was a rendering we made. The blocks are cast with absolutely gray concrete so that they're direct. They're poured over a number of days, and as the temperature and humidity and the circumstances of the plant change, they will turn out to be slightly different tones with slightly different holes with air, with, everything changes. And so we wanted that materiality to begin to honor that particular material. Precast is so often now doctored up. You want it to be plain, you want it to be without color difference. We wanted to see the nature of the concrete there. And we wanted this building to kind of emerge with that material, the kind of direct material. The contemporary art, this art of our time, is really pretty remarkable. We wanted it to emerge out of a quiet architecture, but a kind of a direct architecture. An architecture not of sheetrock, but of a kind of a materiality that had weight to it and allow that work to sit against a direct natural material, emerge out of the landscape. Yes?
In reference to that same building, I'm wondering, it recalled work of Zumthor a lot, the way the real material stacked up like that. But it was filled with poche that he would probably just be used as more concrete. That poche would have just been solid concrete. Now, I wonder if that's the same, and if you have any opinions about the difference between your kind of phenomenological approach and his that way.
Well, it's hard not to do a project like that and not look at the bath involves. I mean, you have to do that now. I think he's a very important voice. I think we were kind of I think our inspiration for the block came from the stacked wood. I think we looked for a long time there about how to really have a kind of sense of honesty there. In terms of the poche, I think the poche in this case is the earth. I think the earth really comes out and grabs these forms, and there is not a lot of, the only thing that's really between those buildings is the ground. And so I think of the bath, I think, is a little bit more contained, and the poche exists within the figure. Ours, I think, kind of stretches out, and the poche is the dirt there, I think. And I think... the top, yes. And I mean, to make a work like that, you can imagine all of the disciplines that have got to move around that building, from HVAC to sprinklers to smoke sniffers, as I call them, to lights. I mean, all of the conduit and everything has to kind of circumvent its way up. But we searched for a long time, not starting with the idea of making poche, but we started with the notion of the light. And where do you want to start the light? Where does it want to come in, and how does it want to fall in that space? And we did lots and lots of studies in model to determine a character of light for each one of those pavilions, so that the light on the works would be soft and yet moving there. And so it really came down to the light there. Yes?
You introduced the lecture and you're talking about slowing down, really thinking about things, and throughout the lecture using the word, this idea of really reflecting on things and taking your time and so on. It's evident in the work. But how does that stack up with the kind of commercial logic of running an office, especially in New York, where I guess the rental must be very high? And there's a kind of battle going on with this kind of process, because most commercial places knock out the same thing again and again. I mean, is that a conflict in your work, trying to slow down and yet keep things?
Well, you would, there are some clients that are really extraordinary, who give you the time and the spirit to study. They all have schedules, they all have budgets. I mean, they absolutely do. But I think there is a kind of curiosity there from some of our extraordinary clients that allows us to work with them and to kind of let the work emerge, where we don't know where it's going and they don't know where it's going either. And I think there's a huge amount of trust there. I don't think we take much longer than anyone else, but there's a kind of a trust there with our clients that makes an enormous amount of difference to me. But I think there is the commercialization of art, and there's that first slide with all of those people seeing the Mona Lisa. It's hard to walk around in MoMA now without having that hurried experience where you really don't understand the works, I think. You don't, it's like, the Ed Reinhardt thing. You don't get lost in the work. And I think that we're fortunate to have some clients there that want to try to make a place where that is helped.
I guess it's for the Raymond Courthouse once made the observation in the lecture at the AIA that the difference in the artist that you obviously clearly huge influence in your work, and an architect is an architect only takes a fixed percentage of the cost of construction. And you could be the best architect in the world or the worst architect, you'll still get paid the same. Whereas if you're a really famous artist, you can get paid $1 million, and if you're no good, you pay nothing. So it's a fixed percentage. It's really constraining the logic of how an architect operates.
One thing is guaranteed after I've spent 15 years now with my own practice. This is not a money-making adventure. It's just not. It's a love. It is an absolute love. And I love it.
Well, I think it's perfect moment to stop.
It's getting way too heady.
And feeding the love of architecture. And that's what the reason we're here for. It's really to celebrate that life that collaborated through all the trades, but also with
Yes,
all
thank you so
here
much.
and the family of Jerde. And again, thank Tom for his excellence, generosity, and everything he shared with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.